Welcome to Wednesday, What If, by the Storyteller. What if Wednesday Addams was a witch, just like her ancestor Goody Addams? What if Wednesday was called upon by Goody when her powers started manifesting a year earlier than in the original timeline, and she met Tyler before Miss Thornhill, a.k.a. Laura Gates? Like, comment, and subscribe to be updated. Chapter 11, The Cold Reveal. The tension in the room was palpable, even amidst the chatter and festivities of Wednesday's quinceañera. Despite the lavish setting of Nevermore Academy, the dark undercurrents that ran through the Addams family were always present, especially tonight. Judah, looking sharp in his black tailored suit, proudly introduced his girlfriend and soon-to-be fiancée, Leah. She stood next to him, poised and calm, a long black silk dress sweeping the floor, her blonde hair cascading in soft waves. Leah's smile was immaculate, but there was a coldness behind her eyes, something Wednesday couldn't quite place, but it made her stomach churn. Judah turned toward Wednesday, who stood nearby, watching the scene with a neutral expression. "Cousin, I'd like you to meet Leah," he said, his voice carrying a sense of finality, as if the decision had already been made. Wednesday didn't move to embrace her, but simply nodded, her sharp eyes assessing Leah. "Of course," she replied in her usual deadpan tone. "It's always interesting to meet new family members." Leah extended her hand. "It's an honor to finally meet you, Wednesday," she said, her voice sweet and deliberate. Wednesday took her hand with a firm grip. "Likewise," she replied coolly, her gaze flicking to Judah. "I hope you understand the significance of what you're about to get yourself into." Judah chuckled lightly, clearly unfazed. "It's nothing we can't handle," he said with a knowing smile. "Leah and I are a good match." From the corner of the room, Morticia and Gomez exchanged a glance, their expressions shifting slightly. They were well practiced in maintaining their composure, but there was a hint of concern behind their eyes as they turned toward their nephew. "Aunt Morticia, Uncle Gomez," Judah continued, gesturing to the pair. "I'd like you to meet Leah." Morticia smiled, her dark eyes studying Leah with a subtle intensity. "It's a pleasure to meet you, dear," she said softly, though there was something colder about her tone than usual. Gomez stepped forward next, a broad smile on his face. "Ah, welcome, welcome." He grasped Leah's hand in both of his mustache twitching with enthusiasm. "Anyone who has captured my nephew's heart must be a woman of exceptional taste." Leah nodded politely, though her smile seemed rehearsed. "Thank you, Uncle Gomez. I'm very excited to become part of the family." Endora, who had been observing quietly from the side, now spoke, her voice low but commanding. "You must be careful, Leah," she warned, her sharp eyes narrowing. "The Addams family doesn't tolerate those who don't respect our ways." Leah's smile never wavered, but there was something unreadable in her expression as she acknowledged Endora's words. "I understand, Grandmama. I have every intention of honoring your family's legacy." Wednesday's gaze remained fixed on Leah. It wasn't lost on her how Leah's words danced so smoothly around the edges of what was truly expected. It was clear Leah wasn't interested in love, but power. And if she was about to enter the fold of their family, she'd have to prove she could handle it. 3 years is a long time to know someone, Wednesday remarked flatly. "But I hope you understand that this family doesn't take kindly to anyone rushing into things." Judah's smile faltered for just a moment before he regained his composure. "We're sure, Wednesday. You don't need to worry. Remember what happened the last time someone joined our family so quickly?" Wednesday's voice was icy, and her eyes flickered over to her parents. Aunt Debbie didn't last long after that. A cold silence fell over the group at the mention of Debbie, the last woman to attempt to ingratiate herself with the family. She'd tried to steal money from them, and as Wednesday had pointed out, it had not ended well. Leah's eyes flickered, but she quickly masked her reaction. "I'm not looking to take anything from anyone," she said, her voice cool and controlled. "I just want to join a family where I'll finally be respected and protected." Gomez stepped in, sensing the rising tension. "Well, Leah," he said warmly, "you'll certainly get the respect you deserve around here. But," he added, glancing over at Wednesday with a knowing look, "we don't take kindly to disrespect." So be sure to understand that. Wednesday's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Leah was still too polished, too controlled. She wasn't the type to be easily swayed. But Wednesday had a feeling that her eagerness to join the family was more about what they could give her than anything else. As the introductions were made, Tyler, who had been quietly observing the exchange from the edge of the room, stepped forward, a little hesitant but determined to meet everyone. His face was still somewhat strained from their earlier conversation, but he forced a smile as he turned toward Judah. "Tyler," Wednesday said, her tone softening for a brief moment, "this is my cousin Judah. And this," she paused, turning to Leah, "is his fiancée, Leah." Tyler's smile was tight, but he shook Judah's hand. "Nice to meet you, Judah," he said, his voice measured. Judah smiled, though there was an edge to it. "Likewise, Tyler. I've heard a lot about you." As they exchanged pleasantries, Wednesday's gaze stayed fixed on Leah, her thoughts clouded with suspicion. She'd seen this type before, the opportunist who wanted to belong, for all the wrong reasons. 3 years, huh?" Wednesday said, her words carrying a weight that only Leah seemed to understand. "That's a long time to be sure about someone." Leah's eyes flickered briefly before she responded, her smile unwavering. "When you know, you know." Wednesday's expression didn't change, but in her mind, the calculation was already happening. There was something about Leah that didn't sit right. And as much as she wanted to let her cousin make his own decisions, she couldn't shake the feeling that history was about to repeat itself. But as she glanced at her parents, Morticia's eyes dark and wary, Gomez's face unreadable, and Endora's sharp gaze never leaving Leah, she knew the family shared her concern. The clock struck midnight, and the ballroom of Nevermore Academy was slowly beginning to empty, the echoes of laughter and soft conversation fading into silence. The grandeur of Wednesday's quinceañera, though seemingly concluded, still hung in the air like a lingering scent. The guests, now in smaller clusters, were either trickling out or lingering in quiet conversation, their faces a mix of wonder and intrigue at what had transpired throughout the night. Xavier leaned against one of the columns, his hands tucked into the pockets of his black suit, his expression unreadable but his eyes flicking between Wednesday and Tyler. His presence was quiet but observant, his mind clearly racing with thoughts he'd yet to voice. Bianca, Eden, and Yoko stood off to the side, the trio engaged in a hushed conversation that seemed to carry a weight only they understood. Bianca, always the one to notice the finer details, had picked up on the tension that flared between Tyler and Wednesday, but she wisely kept her distance, sensing that no one wanted to voice the things swirling beneath the surface. Eden, ever the empath, occasionally glanced toward Tyler, her eyes softening with the quiet understanding of someone who knew what it was like to be caught between family secrets and the truths one wished they'd never uncovered. Ajax, standing close to her, appeared more detached, but his eyes were calculating, catching every interaction, every unspoken word. His loyalty to Wednesday was evident, though he, too, could feel the unease that accompanied this family's complex web. In the far corner of the room, Gomez and Morticia stood with Pugsley, the family in their quiet but harmonious unity. Gomez's arm was wrapped around Morticia's waist, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder as they exchanged murmured words. The sight of their unity, despite the chaos that had surrounded the evening, was a testament to their undying bond. Endora, ever the stoic matriarch, stood beside them, her eyes glittering with the sharp wisdom only age could bring. She moved slowly but purposefully, her cane tapping softly against the polished floor. "I think it's time we head out," Morticia said softly, her voice rich with affection but also a sense of finality. Pugsley smiled warmly, taking Endora's arm. "Come, Grandmama, let's get you home." Endora gave a soft but approving nod. "Yes, I've seen enough for one night." The family, now gathered, began to make their way toward the exit, the servants quietly following behind them, assisting with the final preparations to leave. The sounds of the ballroom faded as the main guests made their final farewells, the Addams family heading to their private quarters, leaving a much quieter scene behind them. In the midst of all the departure, Tyler remained standing near the edge of the room, his face still a mix of confusion and frustration. He had caught sight of Wednesday, who stood across the room, her expression cold, unreadable. He wasn't sure how to approach her after everything that had been revealed tonight, everything that had been kept from him. He turned away, frustration boiling up once more as he made his way toward the grand staircase, clearly needing to process everything in solitude. As he passed through the corridor, Adele emerged from the shadows, her silhouette a quiet presence against the backdrop of the evening's calm. She had been watching him for a while now, her sharp gaze taking in his every movement. As he noticed her, he stopped, but his posture remained stiff. There was a distance between them, an unspoken tension hanging thick in the air. "You finally found out," Adele said, her voice measured, almost detached, but there was a touch of empathy beneath her words. Tyler's eyes narrowed, a frown tugging at the corner of his lips. His frustration was palpable as he turned to face her. "You told her not to tell me," he said, his voice thick with resentment. "You didn't think I could handle the truth?" Adele exhaled a long, quiet breath, her expression unreadable, but not unkind. "Come on, kid," she said, taking a step toward him. "Aren't you being unfair? You think she can handle a delicate situation like this? You're not her responsibility. But she cares for you, remember that." Her gaze softened slightly as she watched him, her voice steady but gentle. "She was protecting you, not from the truth, but from the weight of it all. She's not like the others, Tyler. She doesn't know how to show care in the same way. But trust me, she does care." Tyler stared at her, biting back a retort. A part of him still felt angered by how things had played out. He'd spent years in the dark, only to be blindsided by revelations about his mother and his connection to the Addams family. But beneath that anger, there was a twinge of something else, something softer, that he was hesitant to acknowledge. Adele's voice lowered, becoming almost a whisper. "She might not have handled it perfectly, but don't make her the villain here. She's just as lost as you are, but she's fighting for you, in her own way." Tyler's gaze softened slightly, though he still wore the remnants of his earlier frustration. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, Adele held up a hand, her eyes locking onto his. "Take your time," she said. "There's no rush. But when you're ready, she'll be there. And so will the rest of us." With that, she gave him a knowing look before turning and leaving him to his thoughts. Tyler stood there for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in, the truth settling over him like a heavy blanket. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to breathe a little easier, knowing that despite everything, there was still a chance, maybe even a better chance than he had realized, that he wasn't as alone as he thought. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor as Adele vanished into the shadows, leaving Tyler with nothing but his thoughts and the growing realization that, perhaps, there was more to his place in the Addams family than he had ever imagined. The night was over, but the questions remained. The air inside the Weathervane was warm and smelled of fresh coffee, but for Wednesday, it felt like a cold, empty room. She walked in, head held high, the usual cloak of composure draped around her like armor. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden floor as she made her way to her regular table by the window, a silent routine that had gone unchanged. It wasn't the first time she'd been here since the quinceañera, but today, the tension in the air felt more palpable than ever. Tyler was behind the counter, preparing her coffee. He didn't speak, just made the drink like he had done 100 times before. Wednesday didn't acknowledge him either, simply sliding into her seat and pulling out her book. But Tyler watched her, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than it should have. His mind was elsewhere, caught in the whirlwind of questions he couldn't seem to shake. The truth about his mother, the silence around it, the secrecy. He'd tried to talk to his father about it, but every time he brought it up, his dad deflected, sidestepping the conversation as if he were navigating a minefield. Tyler didn't understand. Why wouldn't his father tell him? Why the secrets? Why avoid the truth? Tyler gripped the edge of the counter, fighting the urge to storm into his father's office and demand answers. But what would he say? How could he ask without making things worse? It felt like everything had already been blown out of proportion. But then, as if by instinct, he pulled out his phone. His fingers hesitated over the screen before dialing a number he knew would always offer him clarity. The phone rang twice before Adele picked up. "Tyler?" Her voice was familiar, calm as always. "You sound not yourself. What's going on?" Tyler leaned against the counter, trying to steady his breath. "I'm lost, Adele. I've tried talking to my dad. I've tried asking about Mom, but every time I do, he avoids it. He deflects, like he doesn't want to talk about her at all. It's like there's this huge wall between us now, and I don't know how to break it down. And Wednesday, she's not talking to me either." Adele paused, her voice turning thoughtful. "I see." Tyler's frustration surged. "What do I do, Adele? I just want to know the truth. I want to know who she really was. But I can't get anyone to give me a straight answer." Adele's voice softened, but there was an underlying authority in it. "Tyler, you're not the only one who's been affected by your mom's past, but I can tell you one thing, pushing your dad too hard won't help you get the answers you're looking for. You need to understand that people, especially those closest to us, aren't always ready to face certain truths. And sometimes, they don't know how to share those truths without feeling like they'll lose something. Whether it's you, or themselves, or their sense of control over the situation." "I'm not asking him to share everything right now," Tyler said, his voice tight. "I just want him to talk to me. I need him to stop avoiding me." "I get that. But Tyler, you have to realize that your dad isn't avoiding you, he's avoiding himself. This is bigger than you two, and he's struggling with it. But you can't force him to open up. You have to give him room to come to you when he's ready." Adele's voice was firm now, like she was trying to pull him back from the edge. "Trust me when I say this, he will talk to you when the time is right, but you have to be patient. He needs to know that you're not going anywhere, that you can handle whatever comes next." Tyler clenched his jaw, pacing the floor behind the counter. "So I just wait? I've waited long enough. I want to know now. I can't keep living in this unknown." Adele sighed, but there was a slight understanding in her tone. "I know it's hard, Tyler. But the more you press, the more you might make him retreat. Sometimes you have to give people the time and space to find their own courage. Your father cares about you. Don't doubt that. But he has to be ready to face the truth. And as much as you want to know, you can't control when that moment will come. What you can control is how you handle it when it does." Tyler stood still, letting her words sink in. He wanted to argue, to say it wasn't fair, that he deserved answers. But Adele was right. His dad's avoidance wasn't about him, it was about something much deeper. And maybe, just maybe, waiting wasn't the worst thing he could do. "Okay," Tyler said, his voice quieter now. "But how do I deal with Wednesday? She's not talking to me. We've barely said 2 words since the quinceañera." Adele chuckled softly. "Ah, Wednesday. She's complicated, but if there's one thing I know, it's that she cares about you. She might not show it, but she does. Just give her time. She has a lot on her plate right now, too. Don't push her too hard either." Tyler ran a hand through his hair, frustration still bubbling beneath the surface, but the weight of Adele's advice settled into him. "Yeah, I get it. I'll try to give her some space, too. It's just hard, you know?" "I know," Adele said softly. "But you've got this, Tyler. Be patient with your dad, be patient with Wednesday, and most importantly, be patient with yourself." Tyler hung up, standing in the quiet of the Weathervane, the hum of the cafe surrounding him. He glanced over at Wednesday, still sitting at her usual table, her book open, but her gaze distant. He wanted to go over, sit next to her, talk to her, but something held him back. Adele was right. He needed to give her time. Maybe it was time he gave himself some, too. Tyler sighed and turned back toward the counter, the weight of his thoughts heavy, but at least now there was a bit of clarity in the fog. Time. Patience. That was the answer, even if it wasn't what he wanted to hear. The truth would come. Eventually. And when it did, he'd be ready for it. The session room was heavy with the silence that had followed Wednesday's blunt declaration. The air felt thicker, as though everything she said hung suspended, leaving Dr. Kimbot grappling with the unexpected shift. Wednesday, seated with her usual impassive expression, spoke again, without any further preamble. My cousin is also a therapist. I'll be seeing her from now on. Dr. Kimbot blinked, her pen frozen mid-air, unable to immediately form a response. It was as though a sudden earthquake had disrupted the solid ground of their sessions. She cleared her throat before muttering, "That's great." Wednesday's gaze never wavered. She's also a lawyer. A small, tight smile appeared on Dr. Kimbot's lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. She sounds very outstanding. Yes, Wednesday replied smoothly, her voice level. She seems to be more effective than you when giving me advice. The words landed like a blow, making Dr. Kimbot stiffen. Her grip on her pen tightened involuntarily. On what? She managed to ask, trying to maintain her composure. That's on a need-to-know basis, Wednesday said with a slight tilt of her head. The point is, I no longer see the point in seeing you. Before Dr. Kimbot could respond, a sudden vibration interrupted the tense stillness. Wednesday looked at her phone, glanced briefly at Dr. Kimbot, and then answered without hesitation, her voice cold but calm. Adele, I'm in therapy. Dr. Kimbot was taken aback. The abruptness of Wednesday's phone conversation added to the tension already building in the room. Still, Dr. Kimbot stayed quiet, unable to do anything but watch. She had long learned that engaging Wednesday too aggressively only pushed her further into silence. Adele's voice came through clearly on the speaker. Good, because I just had a therapy session with Tyler. At the mention of Tyler, Wednesday's posture shifted imperceptibly, but the icy detachment remained. You want me to ask what you talked about? Adele's response was swift and blunt. Talk to him, Wednesday. Wednesday frowned slightly, her tone skeptical. I don't know what to say to him. You don't have to say anything to him, Adele replied, her voice firm. Just be there. He's already having problems with his dad. You don't need to add to that. The room seemed to grow colder as Wednesday's expression turned more guarded. Easier said than done. Why don't I just tell him what he wants to know from his dad? The change in Adele's tone was sharp now, urgent. That is not your secret to tell, Wednesday. Wednesday's fingers drummed lightly on the arm of her chair, irritation flickering in her eyes, though her voice remained even. I want things the way they were. Adele's response was final, no hint of softness. Things are not going to go back to the way they were. That's over. Tyler has every right to know about his mother. Go sit beside him, Wednesday. There was a pause, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed as though Wednesday might argue further. But then, her voice dropped to a barely audible murmur. Fine. The word was like the softest of acknowledgments, yet there was something haunting in the way it was spoken. Dr. Kimbot could only watch as Wednesday hung up, her demeanor shifting from cool indifference to something more distant, as if she had already detached from the conversation, from the room, and perhaps from everything happening around her. The unsettling quiet lingered. After a beat, Dr. Kimbot, still processing the conversation she had just overheard, asked, her voice laced with concern, "What's that about Tyler?" But Wednesday was already standing, grabbing her coat from the back of the chair. She didn't spare Dr. Kimbot another glance. Her tone was clipped, devoid of warmth. That's a need-to-know basis. She moved to the door with swift, deliberate steps. I think we're done here. With that, she walked out, leaving Dr. Kimbot sitting alone, the pen still frozen in her hand. The room felt oddly empty now, as though the air had been sucked out, leaving behind only the remnants of an unsettling conversation. Dr. Kimbot, not quite sure how to process the abruptness of it all, sat there, motionless. The silence in the room was deafening, and she was left with one resounding thought: what just happened? She shook her head slightly, her mind racing, but there was nothing to do now but stare at the door through which Wednesday had just exited, wondering what secrets still lay hidden beneath the cryptic layers of their conversations. The night had settled over the city like a heavy blanket, the cold creeping through the streets as winter made its quiet, inevitable arrival. The windows of the Weathervane Café were fogged up from the warmth inside, casting a soft, amber glow onto the sidewalk. The cozy little café was nearly empty, save for a few scattered patrons nursing cups of hot cocoa and coffee. Tyler was working the late shift tonight, wiping down tables and adjusting the chairs as the clock ticked toward closing time. "We're close," he muttered to himself, glancing at the door as the wind howled outside. He moved toward the register, readying himself for the last few minutes of his shift when the bell over the door chimed softly. His heart skipped a beat when he saw her, Wednesday, her dark coat practically swallowing her slender frame, her eyes as unreadable as ever. She stepped inside without hesitation, the cold air following her in like a shadow, and she didn't spare him a glance as she made her way deeper into the café. "Then you should lock your doors," she said, her voice flat, but there was something in it that made Tyler's breath catch. She always had this way of making everything sound like an unspoken challenge. Tyler turned around, offering her a weak smile, though he could feel the tension creeping up on him. "Hi," he said hesitantly. "If I've done something wrong, I apologize for whatever it is. Just talk to me. Please, Wednesday." Wednesday paused, just standing there for a moment, her back straight, eyes fixed on him. She looked like she was considering something, weighing it all in her mind. "I don't know what to say to you," she said finally, and Tyler could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Tyler blinked, caught off guard by her words. His mind raced as he tried to process what she meant. "That's fine, I guess." "Is it?" she asked, her voice softer now, but there was still that guarded edge to it. "Adele told me I should just sit with you." Tyler's brow furrowed as he took a step toward her, his voice a little more urgent now. "She told you?" "Yes," Wednesday answered, her lips curling into something faintly amused, but distant. She folded her arms, looking down at the table beside her as if it held the answers to the questions she couldn't put into words. Tyler's lips parted, his confusion giving way to a nervous, half-formed smile. "I don't know what to say to you," she continued, her words coming slowly. "And by that, I mean, I don't know what to say to you." Tyler's smile widened, a glint of something like relief flashing in his eyes. He moved closer, the distance between them shrinking with each step, until he was standing right in front of her. The way she was looking at him now, the vulnerability flickering behind her usual mask, made his heart beat just a little faster. "That's fine," he said quietly, his voice soft, as if the simple act of her standing there was enough. He reached out, tentatively brushing a strand of her dark hair from her face. "Just stay here," he said, his voice low but steady, his hands gently resting on the table between them. "That's all I want." Wednesday's eyes flicked to his hands, then back up to meet his gaze, her own features unreadable. She shifted slightly, as though she were unsure how to process the weight of his words. "What do you want from me, Tyler?" she asked, her voice flat, but there was a hint of something beneath it, something he could feel, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. Tyler's smile faltered, but he stepped a little closer. He looked into her eyes, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken words and the weight of everything they had never said. "I know it's a bit late for me to be saying this," he started, his voice quiet but steady, "but I want us to be more than friends." Wednesday froze, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. She searched his face, looking for something. A flaw, a crack in his words. But there was none. He was being utterly vulnerable, and in that moment, it made her heart beat faster. "You should know by now that I'm not friend material," she said, her voice low, tinged with a trace of something almost resigned. "Let alone more than friend material. I'll ignore you, stamp on your heart, and always put my needs and interests first." Tyler's gaze softened, but there was no hesitation in his words. "That's fine too." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the air around them heavy with the electric tension that only grew stronger with each passing second. And then, as if driven by an invisible force, Wednesday took a small step toward him, her hand reaching out to gently touch his arm. Her touch was soft, but it felt like a declaration, an unspoken understanding between them. Tyler didn't hesitate. His hand moved to her cheek, his thumb brushing against her skin in the gentlest of motions. Her lips parted, and without thinking, he leaned in, closing the distance between them, and kissed her. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, like they were both testing the waters. But then, as their lips met again, the tentative nature melted away, replaced with something deeper, more urgent. Tyler's hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer, feeling the warmth of her body against his as the world around them seemed to disappear. Wednesday responded with equal intensity, her fingers threading into his hair, her body pressing into his. The kiss deepened, the sensation of it swirling around them, the taste of him like something that had always been there, something inevitable. The cold outside didn't matter anymore, there was only the heat between them, only the feeling of being lost in this moment, in each other. Tyler's hands moved, caressing the sides of her face, holding her close as though he never wanted to let go. And Wednesday, who had always kept everyone at arm's length, found herself completely drawn in, unable to pull away even if she wanted to. It was a kiss that carried all the unspoken words, all the doubts, the longing, the hesitation, and the desire. It was everything they hadn't said until now. It was everything they needed in that moment. When they finally pulled away, breathless and a little dizzy from the intensity, Wednesday's eyes met his, softer now, but still searching. Tyler, with his own chest rising and falling rapidly, smiled, his hand still resting against her cheek. "Stay," he whispered again, his voice hoarse. "Stay with me." She didn't answer, not in words, but her hand, still on his arm, tightened just slightly. That, in itself, was more than enough. The car hummed quietly as it rolled down the road, the cold air outside creeping in through the windows and mixing with the palpable tension inside the vehicle. Snowflakes fluttered past the windshield, their delicate forms quickly dissolving on contact with the glass. Inside, the silence was thick, oppressive. Wednesday sat with her arms crossed, the envelope resting on her lap, her gaze fixed out the window. She had no idea what to say, or if there was anything she could say to make this moment easier for him. Tyler, sitting next to her, gripped the wheel with tense hands, his eyes focused on the road but his mind far away. He'd asked for this, begged for the truth, but now that it was so close, the weight of it felt unbearable. Wednesday's voice cut through the silence, soft yet laced with uncertainty. "Are you sure?" Her words were hesitant, her concern for him palpable. She wanted to help, but she wasn't sure how. Comfort wasn't something she was good at. Not even for him. Tyler didn't look at her. "At this point, it doesn't matter who it comes from. Either it's from my dad, or from you, or from Adele. I just want to know the truth." His voice was quiet, strained, like he was holding himself together by sheer will. Wednesday hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the envelope, before she finally nodded. "All right. I'll get it for you then." With a slight shift in her posture, she reached into her bag, pulling out the manila envelope that Adele had mailed to her. The file inside was thick, heavy with the weight of secrets. The words Françoise Galpin were printed in bold on the top. Tyler's mother. His entire life had been a series of questions, and now, for better or worse, the answers were here. She handed it to him silently, watching as his fingers fumbled to take it. Tyler looked at the file in his hands, his chest tightening. His voice was barely audible as he spoke. "I don't even know if I want to open it." "You should," Wednesday said softly, her tone almost apologetic. "But there's more to understand than just this file. I know it's a lot, but it's important you understand what a hide is, too." She reached into her bag again, this time pulling out an old, worn journal. It was heavy in her hands, the leather cracked from years of age, but she offered it to him anyway. "This is a journal from Dr. Faulkner. He studied people like you, your kind. I found it in the Nightshade Library." Tyler stared at the journal for a long moment, as though it were another weight he couldn't bear to lift. The words hides are subservient to whoever unlocks them, either through trauma, hypnosis, or chemical induction, jumped off the page as he flipped it open. The truth of it hit him like a punch to the gut, and the air felt suddenly thick with the enormity of what he was reading. His breath caught in his throat as he closed the journal with a snap. She was a monster. No, Wednesday said, her voice quiet but firm. She wasn't a monster, Tyler. She was sick. She couldn't control it. His hands clenched, anger mixing with confusion. She hunted people like me, Wednesday. She knew what I was, before I even knew what I was. She wasn't just sick, she was a monster. Wednesday was silent for a long moment, her eyes meeting his with an understanding that most people would never possess. She didn't try to change his mind, but she knew better than to let him wallow in that thought. She wasn't a monster. She was lost, and I know it's hard to see that, but she wasn't. You're not her. Tyler met her eyes, and for the first time, something softer passed between them. The truth was painful, but he needed to hear it. Am I a monster too? His voice cracked, the vulnerability raw and fragile. No, Wednesday answered firmly, her voice softening as she spoke. You're not a monster. He looked away, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter as his mind spun. How can you say that? How do you know? Because, she said after a long pause, her voice low but sure, if you're a monster, then I'm a monster too. At least your kind was, not burned at the stake. Me? I'm trying to make you feel better, but that's the truth. I've seen darkness. I've walked through it. And it doesn't mean you're a monster. Tyler's lips trembled slightly as he let her words sink in. I know, you think I'm going to turn out like her. She was silent for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She didn't need to say it, but she couldn't leave it unspoken. You survived an entire summer in the Addams mansion. Believe me, trauma is probably the least of your worries. She said it without mockery, her voice flat but filled with a hint of her own dark humor. It was an attempt to soften the blow, but it wasn't meant to trivialize his fear, it was simply her way of saying that he wasn't alone in this fight. Tyler let out a shaky breath, turning his head slightly to look at her. There was a pause, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, the silence heavy but familiar. Tyler reached down and picked up the envelope again, this time with more resolve, though his hand still shook. The next day, Nevermore's gate stood tall and snow-covered, the sound of students milling about mixing with the winter air. Wednesday stood at the entrance, her bag slung over one shoulder, looking like she belonged to neither world, neither the one she was leaving behind nor the one she was returning to. The end of the semester, the break, it all felt like a necessary distance between her and everything she'd just learned about Tyler. Tyler was beside her, his hands in his pockets, eyes tired but determined as they stood there. The air between them was thick with everything they'd shared over the past few days, the painful truth, the uncertainty, and the quiet bond they had formed. Eden, Bianca, Xavier, Ajax, and Yoko gathered around, their faces a mix of casual smiles and quiet farewells. It wasn't anything special, but it felt significant in its own way. Tyler stood at the gates, just a few feet from Wednesday, his gaze flickering to her now and then. Take care of yourself, Bianca said to Xavier, her voice as warm as it could be, though her smile was slightly guarded. Xavier clapped her on the back, a silent show of solidarity. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. But then, it was Tyler who made the moment even more memorable. He took a breath, stepped forward, and without hesitation, kissed Wednesday on the cheek. The kiss was soft, lingering just a moment, but when he pulled away, his eyes held something deeper than words could explain. Take it as a Christmas gift, he murmured, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Eden's phone was out before anyone could blink, capturing the moment and immediately posting it to her blog with a sly caption. Wednesday, on the other hand, stood there, unmoving, her face expressionless, despite the kiss. Christmas is a dead tree in my family, she said flatly, but there was a faint warmth behind her words, the kind she reserved for moments like these. Tyler chuckled softly, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he said, Take care, Wednesday. I will, she replied, her voice soft but sincere. You too, Tyler. You'll be all right. With that, she turned and walked toward the car waiting for her at the gates, the rest of the team following behind. The snow continued to fall softly around them, a blanket of silence descending once again. Tyler watched her go, his heart a mix of emotions, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a small spark of hope. Like, comment, and subscribe to be notified for updates on this series.